Everyone avoided the elderly black millionaire woman who lived quietly in the modest ranch house at the end of Maple Street, crossing to the other side of the road when they saw her tending her small garden, pretending not to notice when she waved from her front porch and declining every invitation she extended for neighborhood gatherings. What none of them could have imagined was that the same woman they had systematically excluded from their community for the past 12 years had been quietly documenting their struggles, learning about their dreams, and crafting a will that would transform every single family on their street in ways they never could have anticipated. Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, 84 years old and worth over $15 million from a lifetime of savvy real estate investments, had moved to the predominantly white suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook in 2011 after her husband's death, seeking the kind of quiet community life that had been denied to her during decades of living in segregated neighborhoods. She had chosen the house specifically because of its proximity to excellent schools, well-maintained parks, and the kind of suburban amenities that represented the American dream she had worked her entire life to achieve. The avoidance had begun almost immediately after her arrival, subtle at first, but becoming more pronounced as it became clear that Mrs. Jenkins intended to be a permanent resident rather than a temporary presence. Neighborhood barbecues suddenly became family-only affairs when she expressed interest in attending. The informal coffee mornings that rotated between houses somehow never included her address in the rotation. When she approached neighbors working in their yards to introduce herself, conversations were kept brief and formal, with obvious discomfort about extending social interactions beyond basic politeness. What the residents of Maple Street failed to understand was that Mrs. Jenkins had spent her career observing human behavior and reading social dynamics with the precision that had made her one of the most successful commercial real estate developers in the southeastern United States. She recognized their avoidance for exactly what it was: fear masked as social preference, prejudice disguised as personal choice, and racism rationalized as community standards. But rather than responding with anger or withdrawal, she had chosen a different path entirely. From her front porch, where she spent most afternoons reading or working in her garden, Mrs. Jenkins had become the neighborhood's unofficial observer and chronicler. She had watched the Hendersons at number 42 struggle through Mr. Henderson's unemployment period, noting when their newspaper delivery stopped and when they began shopping at discount grocery stores instead of the upscale market they had previously frequented. She had observed the Patels at number 38, dealing with their teenager's medical crisis, seeing the stress in their faces as they made frequent trips to specialist appointments, and noting the medical equipment delivery truck that had become a regular presence in their driveway. The Johnsons at number 46 had been particularly fascinating to observe, not because of any crisis, but because of their obvious financial stress, despite their efforts to maintain appearances. Mrs. Jenkins had noticed the pattern of expensive cars being replaced with older models, the gradual scaling back of lawn care services, and the way Mrs. Johnson had begun shopping sales and using coupons despite her previous dismissive comments about bargain hunting. The family's struggle to maintain their lifestyle while dealing with what was obviously a significant reduction in income had been playing out in small details that most neighbors missed, but that Mrs. Jenkins's trained eye had catalogued carefully. Each family on Maple Street had become a chapter in Mrs. Jenkins's mental notebook, their struggles and challenges documented not out of nosiness, but out of genuine concern for people she considered neighbors, despite their refusal to consider her one. The Martinez family at number 50 had been dealing with aging parents and the financial strain of long-term care. The Williamses at number 34 were clearly struggling to support their college-aged children while maintaining their own retirement plans. The elderly Mr. Chen at number 48 had been showing signs of declining health and increasing isolation since his wife's death the previous year. What made Mrs. Jenkins' observation particularly poignant was that many of these struggles could have been alleviated through simple community support and neighborly assistance, the kind of mutual aid that had sustained her through her own difficult periods earlier in life. But the social barriers that prevented these families from accepting her friendship also prevented them from accessing the resources and support she could have provided long before her death made such assistance possible. The irony was that Mrs. Jenkins had moved to Willowbrook specifically seeking the kind of community connection and mutual support that she remembered from her childhood neighborhood, where families had looked out for each other regardless of economic differences and where elderly residents were valued for their wisdom and experience rather than avoided as inconveniences. Instead, she had found herself in a community where prosperity had created isolation, where success had built walls rather than bridges, and where fear of difference had replaced the natural human instinct to care for neighbors. Mrs. Jenkins' real estate empire had been built on understanding communities and recognizing potential where others saw problems. She had specialized in revitalizing struggling commercial districts, transforming abandoned properties into thriving business centers that created jobs and anchored neighborhood development. Her success had come from seeing value where others saw only decay, from investing in potential rather than just existing success, and from understanding that true wealth came from creating opportunities for others rather than simply accumulating assets for oneself. The same perspective that had made her millions in commercial real estate had informed her approach to personal relationships and community involvement. She had learned to read the subtle signs of financial stress, to recognize when families were struggling despite appearances, and to understand the pride that prevented people from asking for help even when they desperately needed it. These skills, developed over decades of business success, had made her uniquely qualified to understand her neighbors' situations even when they worked hard to hide their difficulties. As Mrs. Jenkins aged and her health began to decline, she had spent increasing amounts of time on estate planning, working with attorneys and financial advisors to structure her wealth in ways that would create maximum impact after her death. The process had been complicated by her lack of direct heirs. She and her husband had never had children, and her extended family was limited to distant cousins who had maintained only sporadic contact over the years. This absence of obvious beneficiaries had given her complete freedom to design a legacy that reflected her values and her understanding of where her wealth could do the most good. The planning process had taken nearly 3 years, involving multiple lawyers, financial advisors, and community research specialists who helped her understand the specific needs and circumstances of families throughout Willowbrook. Mrs. Jenkins had insisted on thorough background research, not out of suspicion, but out of determination to ensure that her gifts would be structured in ways that would provide maximum benefit without creating dependency or resentment. During the final months of her life, as Mrs. Jenkins's health declined and her daily porch observations became less frequent, she had completed the most comprehensive estate plan her legal team had ever encountered. Each neighbor's situation had been studied with the same analytical precision she had once applied to commercial real estate deals, but with a level of personal care and attention that had moved even her experienced attorneys to tears during the planning sessions. The Henderson family's struggles had been particularly well documented in Mrs. Jenkins' notes. She had observed that Mr. Henderson's unemployment had lasted far longer than the family had anticipated, and that Mrs. Henderson had quietly taken a second job working early morning shifts at a bakery to supplement their income. Mrs. Jenkins had noted the stress this schedule was placing on their teenage daughter, who had begun walking to school instead of being driven, and whose college preparation activities had been scaled back due to financial constraints. What the Hendersons never knew was that Mrs. Jenkins had twice attempted to help them directly during their most difficult period. She had anonymously arranged for grocery deliveries to be left at their door, disguised as promotional offers from local stores. She had also attempted to connect Mr. Henderson with business contacts who might offer employment opportunities, but her social isolation in the neighborhood had made such assistance difficult to provide without revealing her involvement. The Patel family's medical crisis had involved their 16-year-old son's diagnosis with a rare autoimmune condition that required expensive treatments not fully covered by their insurance. Mrs. Jenkins had watched the family's stress increase as they navigated specialist appointments, insurance battles, and the mounting costs of medications and therapies. She had observed Mr. Patel working increasingly long hours at his engineering firm, while Mrs. Patel had taken on freelance graphic design work that she completed late into the evenings. Mrs. Jenkins had researched the specific medical condition extensively, consulting with medical professionals and insurance specialists to understand the long-term financial implications for the family. Her estate planning documents included detailed provisions for a medical trust that would cover not just current expenses, but also the ongoing care that would likely be needed throughout the young man's life. The Johnson family's situation had been more complex, involving what appeared to be significant business losses that had forced dramatic lifestyle changes despite their efforts to maintain appearances. Mrs. Jenkins had noted the sale of Mrs. Johnson's luxury car, the cancellation of their country club membership, and the way their social entertaining had shifted from catered events to simple potluck gatherings. The family's teenage children had begun working part-time jobs, and Mrs. Jenkins had observed the stress this financial pressure was placing on what had once been a confident and outgoing family. Through discreet inquiries with business connections, Mrs. Jenkins had learned that Mr. Johnson's consulting firm had lost several major clients during an economic downturn, leaving him struggling to maintain his business while supporting his family's accustomed lifestyle. The pride that prevented him from discussing his difficulties with neighbors was the same pride that had led him to maintain professional appearances even while cutting personal expenses dramatically. If this story is touching your heart, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Mrs. Jenkins had also documented the situations of families who seemed financially stable but were dealing with other challenges that money could address. The elderly Mr. Chen had been increasingly isolated since his wife's death, declining both physically and emotionally in ways that worried Mrs. Jenkins despite their limited interactions. She had noted his struggle with home maintenance tasks that had become too difficult for him to manage alone, and his obvious loneliness during holidays and family-oriented neighborhood events. The Martinez family had been dealing with the dual challenge of supporting aging parents who required assisted living care while also helping their college-age daughter manage educational expenses. Mrs. Jenkins had observed the stress this sandwich generation pressure was creating, with both parents working extra hours and family vacation plans being repeatedly postponed or canceled due to financial obligations. Each family's situation had been analyzed not just for immediate financial needs, but for longer-term challenges and opportunities. Mrs. Jenkins had worked with financial planners to structure trusts and investments that would provide sustainable support rather than one-time windfalls. She had consulted with education specialists, medical professionals, and elder care experts to ensure that her bequests would address root causes rather than just symptoms. The legal complexity of her will had been extraordinary, requiring multiple law firms with different specializations to ensure that all provisions would be legally enforceable and tax-efficient. Mrs. Jenkins had insisted on ironclad language that would prevent any challenges to her intentions. Understanding that her unconventional bequests might face scrutiny from distant relatives or community members who questioned her mental capacity or motivations. What made her estate planning particularly unusual was the level of ongoing oversight and management she had built into each bequest. Rather than simple cash transfers, most of her gifts were structured as managed trusts with specific purposes and professional oversight to ensure long-term benefit. The Henderson family's trust included provisions for job training and small business development loans. The Patel family's medical trust included advocacy services and care coordination. The Johnson family's business recovery fund included mentorship and consulting support to help rebuild their firm. Mrs. Jenkins had also included detailed personal letters to be delivered with each bequest, explaining her observations about their situations and her hopes for how the gifts might be used. These letters had been written and rewritten multiple times, as she struggled to find language that would convey her genuine care and concern without seeming intrusive or condescending. She had wanted each family to understand that her gifts came from neighborly love and community responsibility rather than pity or charity. The will included provisions for community improvements as well, with significant funds designated for neighborhood park renovations, school enhancement programs, and the establishment of a community center that would provide meeting spaces and programming for residents of all ages. Mrs. Jenkins had envisioned these community investments as ways to encourage the kind of neighborly interaction and mutual support that had been missing from Willowbrook despite its prosperity. As her health declined in her final weeks, Mrs. Jenkins had spent her time reviewing and finalizing the details of her estate plan, ensuring that every provision reflected her careful observations and genuine care for neighbors who had never allowed her to express that care during her lifetime. The irony that her death would create the community connections she had sought while living was not lost on her, but she found peace in knowing that her legacy would benefit people she had learned to love from a distance. The news of Mrs. Jenkins's death reached the Willowbrook neighborhood through a simple funeral notice in the local newspaper, announcing a memorial service that none of her neighbors felt obligated to attend. The modest announcement mentioned her passing at age 84 and provided basic details about funeral arrangements, but offered no hint of the bombshell that would detonate in their community just 1 week later when attorney Margaret Foster arrived at each house on Maple Street with registered letters containing the most shocking news any of them had ever received. Mrs. Henderson answered her door on that Tuesday morning, expecting another medical bill or insurance document, certainly not prepared for the elegantly dressed lawyer who introduced herself as the executor of Mrs. Jenkins's estate. The conversation that followed left her sitting at her kitchen table in complete disbelief, staring at legal documents that seemed too extraordinary to be real. Mrs. Henderson, Attorney Foster had explained gently, Ruby Jenkins has left your family a trust fund valued at $1.2 million, specifically designated to address your current financial challenges and to establish long-term security for your family's future, including your daughter's college education and your husband's business development opportunities. The Hendersons had been struggling so intensely with unemployment and mounting bills that the concept of sudden millionaire status seemed like an elaborate hoax or cruel joke. Mrs. Henderson read and reread the legal documents, trying to process how the elderly black woman they had systematically avoided for 12 years had somehow accumulated detailed knowledge of their private struggles and had chosen to address those struggles with life-changing generosity. Across the street, a similar scene was playing out at the Patel household, where Attorney Foster was explaining that their son's medical trust fund would provide comprehensive coverage for his autoimmune condition, including experimental treatments, specialist care, and support services for the entire family. The trust was valued at $800,000 and included provisions for ongoing medical research contributions and advocacy work related to rare autoimmune conditions. Mrs. Jenkins spent considerable time researching your son's condition, Attorney Foster explained to the overwhelmed parents. She consulted with medical specialists and insurance experts to ensure this trust would provide not just current support, but long-term security for his care throughout his lifetime. She wanted you to know that she had observed your family's strength and dedication during this difficult period. The Johnson family's meeting revealed a business recovery trust valued at $900,000, structured to help rebuild Mr. Johnson's consulting firm while providing family financial stability during the recovery period. The trust included mentorship provisions and business development support, along with educational funds for their children and mortgage assistance to prevent any risk of losing their home. Mr. Chen, the elderly widower, learned that he had inherited not just a substantial financial bequest, but also provisions for home care services, social programming, and community connection initiatives designed to address the isolation that Mrs. Jenkins had observed affecting him since his wife's death. His trust included funding for home maintenance, medical care coordination, and participation in community activities that would help rebuild his social connections. Each family received not just financial bequests, but also personal letters from Mrs. Jenkins that revealed the depth of her observation and the genuine nature of her concern for their welfare. The letters were written with remarkable insight into their specific situations and challenges, demonstrating that despite their social distance, she had been paying attention to their lives with the kind of care typically shown only by close family members. The Henderson letter mentioned specific moments when Mrs. Jenkins had noticed their daughter walking to school during bad weather and had wanted to offer rides, but had respected their obvious preference for distance. It described her awareness of Mrs. Henderson's early morning bakery shifts and her admiration for the family's determination to maintain stability despite significant challenges. The Patel letter revealed that Mrs. Jenkins had researched their son's medical condition extensively, consulting with specialists and understanding the long-term implications of his diagnosis. She had written about her observations of their late-night work sessions and her respect for their commitment to providing excellent care while maintaining their family's financial stability. The Johnson letter acknowledged the business difficulties that the family had worked so hard to hide, praising their efforts to maintain stability while dealing with professional setbacks. Mrs. Jenkins had written about noticing the small sacrifices they had made, the change in cars, the shift in social activities, and had wanted them to know that she recognized their strength and resilience during difficult times. As news of the bequests spread throughout the neighborhood, the emotional impact was devastating. Families who had spent 12 years avoiding Mrs. Jenkins suddenly realized that she had been the most attentive and caring neighbor any of them had ever had. The woman they had excluded from community events had been quietly documenting their struggles and planning solutions for problems they thought no one else knew about. The total value of the individual family bequests exceeded $8 million, but Mrs. Jenkins had also left substantial funds for community improvements that would benefit everyone in Willowbrook. A new community center would be built and endowed with programming for all ages. Park improvements would create better recreational facilities, and an ongoing neighborhood support fund would provide emergency assistance for future families facing unexpected challenges. The community provisions included specific programs designed to encourage the kind of neighborly interaction that Mrs. Jenkins had sought during her lifetime. Regular community dinners, neighborhood improvement projects, and social programming for elderly residents would all be funded through her estate, creating opportunities for the connections she had been denied while living. The revelation that transformed understanding most completely was the discovery that Mrs. Jenkins had attempted multiple times to offer assistance and support during her lifetime, but had been prevented by the social barriers her neighbors had erected. Anonymous grocery deliveries, job networking attempts, and other gestures of support had all been quietly provided, but never acknowledged or reciprocated, because the recipients had no idea of their source. The neighborhood that had spent 12 years avoiding one remarkable woman suddenly understood that they had rejected not just her friendship, but also her wisdom, her generosity, and her genuine care for their welfare. The social distance they had maintained to preserve their comfort had prevented them from receiving the kind of support and community connection that Mrs. Jenkins had been ready to provide all along. 1 year after the reading of Mrs. Ruby Jenkins' will transformed the Willowbrook neighborhood forever, the Maple Street Community Center hosted its first annual Ruby Jenkins Memorial Dinner, an event that had become the most meaningful tradition in a community that had learned too late the value of the woman they had spent 12 years avoiding. The dinner was held in the beautifully appointed main hall that bore Mrs. Jenkins' name, funded by her estate and designed to encourage exactly the kind of neighborly connection she had sought during her lifetime. The Henderson family sat at a table near the memorial display, featuring Mrs. Jenkins' photograph and a collection of thank you letters from scholarship recipients who had benefited from the educational foundation established in her name. Mr. Henderson had used his trust fund to complete an advanced certification program and launch a successful consulting business that now employed 3 other neighborhood residents who had been struggling with unemployment. Their daughter had enrolled at her first-choice university with full financial support, and the family had moved from survival mode to stability and hope. Mrs. Henderson often spoke at community events about the guilt and gratitude that had become intertwined in her family's transformation. "We spent 12 years crossing the street to avoid her," she would say, her voice carrying the weight of profound regret. She spent those same 12 years learning about our struggles and planning ways to help us succeed. The shame of that difference will stay with me forever, but so will the determination to honor her example by really seeing and caring for the people around me. The Patel family had become advocates for rare disease research and family support services, using their personal experience with Mrs. Jenkins' generosity to help other families navigate similar medical challenges. Their son's condition was well managed through the comprehensive care provided by his trust fund, and the family had established a non-profit organization that connected families dealing with autoimmune conditions to resources and support networks. Mrs. Patel frequently credited Mrs. Jenkins with teaching them that private struggles could be addressed through community care and mutual support. Mr. Johnson's consulting firm had not only recovered, but had grown into one of the region's most successful minority business development organizations, specifically focused on helping struggling entrepreneurs rebuild and expand their operations. The Business Recovery Trust had provided not just financial stability, but also access to mentorship networks and professional development opportunities that had transformed his approach to both business and community engagement. The elderly Mr. Chen had become the unofficial neighborhood grandfather, his social isolation replaced by active involvement in community programming and intergenerational activities. The home care services provided through his trust had allowed him to age in place with dignity, while the social programming had connected him to younger families who benefited from his wisdom and experience. His transformation from isolated widower to beloved community elder had become one of the most visible examples of Mrs. Jenkins' vision for neighborly support. The Martinez family had been able to transition their aging parents to high-quality assisted living while maintaining their daughter's educational support, relieving the financial pressure that had been straining their marriage and family relationships. They had become coordinators for the neighborhood's elder care support network, helping other families navigate the challenges of caring for aging relatives while maintaining their own family stability. Beyond the individual family transformations, the community itself had been fundamentally changed by Mrs. Jenkins's legacy. The Ruby Jenkins Community Center hosted regular programming that brought neighbors together across generational and cultural lines. Monthly potluck dinners, seasonal celebrations, and ongoing support groups had created the kind of interconnected community that Mrs. Jenkins had envisioned when she moved to Willowbrook seeking neighborly connection. The neighborhood's children had grown up hearing stories about Mrs. Jenkins and the importance of seeing beyond appearances to recognize the value and dignity of every person. A youth mentorship program funded by her estate paired teenagers with elderly residents, creating relationships that honored Mrs. Jenkins's belief in intergenerational wisdom and mutual support. The program had become so successful that other communities had begun requesting consultation on replicating the model. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Click the next one, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes in kindness. The most profound change in the neighborhood had been the shift from a collection of individual households to a genuine community where residents actively looked out for each other's welfare. Mrs. Jenkins' example had taught them that true security came not from maintaining distance from neighbors, but from creating networks of mutual support and care. Families now knew each other's challenges and celebrations, offered assistance without being asked, and understood that community strength came from collective investment in everyone's success. The memorial dinner had become an annual opportunity for reflection and renewal of community commitments. Each year, residents shared stories about how Mrs. Jenkins's legacy continued to influence their daily interactions and long-term planning. New residents were welcomed with the story of Mrs. Jenkins and the expectation that they would contribute to the culture of care and connection she had established through her extraordinary final gift. Attorney Margaret Foster, who had remained involved with the community as trustee of several ongoing funds, often observed that Mrs. Jenkins's estate plan had been the most transformative she had encountered in 30 years of legal practice. Most wills distribute assets, she would explain. Ruby Jenkins' will distributed wisdom, compassion, and community responsibility. She taught an entire neighborhood that wealth means nothing without the relationships and connections that give life meaning. The small ranch house at the end of Maple Street had been converted into a community resource center where families could access emergency assistance, educational support, and social services. A plaque by the front door bore Mrs. Jenkins' final words from her personal letter to the neighborhood. "I moved to Willowbrook seeking community and found isolation. I hope my final gift will help you find the connections that make life rich and meaningful." True wealth is measured not by what we accumulate for ourselves, but by what we share with others. In her modest garden, now maintained by rotating neighborhood volunteers, a memorial bench provided a place for reflection and conversation. Residents often brought their children there to share the story of Mrs. Jenkins and the lesson that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and included in the communities where they live. The woman who had been avoided for 12 years had posthumously created the most connected and caring neighborhood any of the residents had ever experienced. Her death had taught them what her life had been trying to show them all along. That true community comes from seeing past appearances and assumptions to recognize the dignity, wisdom, and potential in every person, regardless of how different they might seem from ourselves.